I came home from work to find my garage door wide open, my tools scattered across the driveway like someone had ransacked the place. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, my boots crunching over broken glass. My workbench was stripped bare, my motorcycle gone. "What the?" a voice cut through the evening air. "Oh, you're finally home, Leonard?" I turned to see her standing on my driveway like she owned the place. Nancy Delacroix, the HOA president, a middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl and a superiority complex. She held a clipboard like it was a scepter. "You can't just break into my garage," I snapped, stepping toward her. Nancy sighed dramatically, flipping through her papers. "Actually, we didn't break in, we repossessed it." I stared at her, my pulse hammering. "You what?" She gave me a look like I was a child who didn't understand the rules. "Unpaid HOA fees, Leonard. We sent notices. Since you refused to comply, we took action. The HOA has claimed your garage as collateral." I clenched my fists. "That's illegal." "It's policy," she said, as if that was law. "You owe the HOA 3 months of fees. We took the liberty of liquidating some of your items to cover the balance." My stomach twisted. "Liquidating?" Nancy tapped her clipboard. "Your motorcycle was towed and sold to a collector. Your tools, well, those were auctioned off this morning." "Don't worry, we kept a record." I could barely breathe. My garage, my stuff gone, and this woman acted like it was just another day of business. "You had no right," I growled. Nancy gave me a tight-lipped smile. "You had every right to pay your dues. Consider this a lesson in responsibility." I took a step forward, towering over her, but she didn't flinch. She was too used to bullying people into submission, but Nancy didn't know something. I'd been working on a little project of my own. I crossed my arms. "Funny thing, Nancy, I just got back from a meeting with the county clerk." Her smirk faltered. I pulled out a neatly folded document from my back pocket and unfolded it slowly. "You see, while you were busy robbing my garage, I was busy buying out the HOA's majority shares. As of this morning, I'm the new HOA president." Nancy's face drained of color. Her grip tightened on her clipboard. "That's impossible." I held up the official document, signed, sealed, and notarized. "You've been running this HOA like your personal kingdom for too long, but as of today, your reign is over." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," I cut her off. "And the first thing I'm doing as HOA president, filing charges for theft and destruction of property. You might want to call a lawyer, Nancy. You're going to need one." She took a step back, her whole world crumbling around her. And I wasn't done yet. Nancy stood frozen on my driveway, her grip tightening on her clipboard as if it could somehow shield her from reality. The neighbors had started to notice the commotion, peeking from their porches and windows. A few even stepped outside, curiosity pulling them toward the unfolding scene. One of them, Mr. Holloway from next door, crossed his arms and called out, "Everything all right, Leonard?" I turned to face him, holding up the notarized document for anyone who wanted to see. "Actually, yeah. Just informing Nancy here that she no longer runs this HOA. As of this morning, I do." A murmur rippled through the small gathering crowd. Nancy's face twitched, her jaw tightening as she struggled to regain control. This is absurd," she snapped. "You can't just swoop in and take over." I arched a brow. "That's exactly what you did with my garage. The difference? What I did was legal." A few chuckles came from the neighbors. Nancy's control over the community had been built on intimidation and convoluted rules. Now, the cracks in her authority were showing, and people were starting to enjoy the sight of her squirming. Before she could sputter out another excuse, I pulled out my phone, scrolling to an email from the county's record office. "If you want to verify it yourself, go ahead. But I'd suggest you start packing up your files, because as of right now, your position as HOA president is terminated." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hands. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She turned on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. I exhaled, watching her disappear down the street. The neighbors still lingered, their eyes bouncing between me and the now empty space where Nancy had stood. Mr. Holloway stepped closer, lowering his voice. You really took over the HOA? I nodded. Bought out the majority shares this morning. He let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Guess we're finally going to see some real changes around here. Another neighbor, Mrs. Patel, crossed her arms. Does this mean we don't have to deal with those ridiculous fines anymore? That's exactly what it means, I assured her. No more bogus citations, no more arbitrary rule changes, and if anyone got fined unfairly, I plan to fix it. A few people exchanged glances, nodding in approval. Mr. Holloway clapped me on the shoulder. About time someone put an end to her nonsense. Let us know if you need anything. I gave him a nod of appreciation before heading inside. The moment I shut the door behind me, I let out a long breath. The adrenaline was still pumping, but now that the immediate confrontation was over, reality was sinking in. I had control of the HOA now, which meant I had a mountain of work ahead of me. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my laptop and started digging through the financial records I'd acquired along with the position. The deeper I went, the more my stomach twisted. Nancy had been running the HOA like her personal bank account. Unauthorized withdrawals, inflated fees, payments marked for maintenance that had no actual work attached to them. And then there was the most damning discovery: an entire section of funds funneled into an account under her name. Straight-up embezzlement. I leaned back, staring at the screen. This wasn't just about reclaiming my stolen property anymore. Nancy had been bleeding this community dry, and I was going to make sure she paid for it. The next morning, I made my first official move as HOA president. I called for an emergency meeting, sending out notices to every homeowner in the neighborhood. By sunset, the community center was packed. People filled every seat, some standing along the walls. The air buzzed with curiosity and anticipation. Nancy was there too, seated near the front with her arms crossed, her expression tight. She was trying to look unfazed, but the slight bounce of her knee gave her away. I stepped up to the front, clearing my throat. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I won't waste your time, so let's get right to it. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the projector screen behind me lit up with financial records. Gasps rippled through the room. For years, this HOA has been charging excessive fees, issuing bogus fines, and mismanaging your hard-earned money, I said, my voice steady. What you're looking at right now is proof of that. Unauthorized transactions, missing funds, and large sums of money funneled into an account under Nancy Delacroix's name. All eyes turned to her. Her face went pale. This is a smear campaign, she burst out. Fabricated nonsense. I didn't even have to respond. Because I had something better. I clicked the remote again and the next slide appeared. A bank statement. The account was directly linked to Nancy and the deposits matched the missing HOA funds exactly. Silence fell over the room. Then a single voice broke it. Mrs. Patel, standing near the back, her voice trembling with anger. You stole from us. Nancy shot up from her seat. I did no such thing. I calmly reached into my folder and pulled out printed copies of the transactions. This is evidence, Nancy. And I've already sent copies to the county's fraud division. She took a step back, her hands trembling. You can't do that. I held her gaze. I already did. The room erupted. Voices overlapped as neighbors turned on her, their frustration and betrayal spilling out in waves. Nancy's head snapped around, desperate for an escape. But there wasn't one. She was finished. Nancy's hands trembled as she clutched the armrest of her chair, her nails digging into the fabric. The room had erupted into chaos, neighbors shouting over one another. Accusations and outrage filled the air, years of frustration finally boiling over. The documents I had displayed on the screen had done their job. There was no way to spin this. No way to worm out of the truth. Nancy's voice cut through the noise, sharp and desperate. This is all a misunderstanding. I've always acted in the best interest of this community. A man near the front, a retired firefighter named Tom, shot to his feet. Best interest. You fined my wife $500 for having a garden gnome. You threatened to put a lien on my house when I questioned it. Several others chimed in, their stories spilling out like floodwaters breaking through a dam. She charged me for a fence repair that never happened. My HOA dues doubled overnight with no explanation. She said the community pool needed renovations, but it's been closed for 2 years. Nancy's eyes darted around, her breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. She had lost control, and she knew it. I lifted my hand, signaling for silence. The crowd quieted just enough for my voice to carry. I think it's clear that Nancy abused her position, but here's the real problem: this HOA was supposed to be run for the benefit of the homeowners. Instead, it was used as a tool to squeeze money from all of you. A hushed agreement rippled through the group. I turned my attention back to Nancy. You stole from these people. You used their money for personal gain. And now you're going to answer for it. She straightened her spine, forcing a thin veneer of composure. You have no right to make these accusations. I reached into my folder and pulled out another document. This is a formal legal complaint filed with the state's fraud division. You're looking at an official investigation into HOA mismanagement and embezzlement, and based on the evidence, I'd say there's a strong case. Her face turned an alarming shade of gray. I set the paper down on the table in front of me. The board will meet to vote for a full audit of the HOA's financial records. Once that's complete, we'll have a clearer picture of just how much money is missing and how much you owe back. A woman in the back, Mrs. Caldwell, raised her voice. What about the money she already spent? Will we ever get it back? I met her gaze. If the investigation proves fraud, the court can order restitution, but that's not all. Since the HOA was used improperly, we have grounds to dissolve it entirely and return full control of the neighborhood back to the homeowners. A stunned silence settled over the room. Then, like a spark catching dry brush, excitement ignited in hushed murmurs and nods of approval. Nancy's breath hitched. You can't do that. Yes, we can, I said, and I'm putting it to a vote tonight. If the majority agrees, we'll start the process of dismantling this corrupt system you built. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand what you're doing, Tom scoffed. Oh, we understand just fine. Nancy's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought she might try one last desperate defense. But then, as the weight of the room pressed in on her, something in her finally broke. She grabbed her purse and shoved back from the table. This is a witch hunt, she spat, her voice thick with fury. I won't stand for it. She turned on her heel and marched toward the door. Before she could leave, I spoke again. One more thing, Nancy. She hesitated, her shoulders stiff. You stole my motorcycle, I said, my voice even but firm. That's grand theft. I'll be pressing charges. She hurried out without another word. As soon as she was gone, the entire room seemed to exhale at once. I looked out at the crowd. We take the vote now. The decision was unanimous. The HOA was officially on its way out. And Nancy. She was about to find out that the laws she had so easily bent didn't work in her favor when the whole neighborhood was watching. The meeting ended with a sense of finality, the weight of Nancy's downfall settling over the neighborhood like the first breath of fresh air after a storm. As people filtered out of the community center, murmuring about the vote and what came next, I stayed behind, collecting the documents I had presented. The gravity of what had just happened wasn't lost on me. This was more than just exposing Nancy's corruption, it was a complete shift in power. Tom lingered near the front, his arms crossed as he watched the last of the attendees exit. He stepped closer, his expression one of quiet admiration. You really did it, he said. I've been dealing with this nonsense for years, and no one ever managed to fight back like this. I stacked the last of the papers and tucked them into my folder. She got away with too much for too long. It was time someone put a stop to it. Tom nodded, then glanced toward the door. You think she's gonna fight this? She doesn't have a choice, I said. The fraud division has everything they need to launch an investigation. Even if she tries to worm her way out, the financial records don't lie. Tom exhaled, shaking his head. Unbelievable, all those fines, all the bogus rules just to line her pockets, makes me sick. I didn't disagree. But there was still work to do. The next morning, I wasted no time. I sent out an official notice to every homeowner detailing the next steps in dissolving the HOA. It wasn't going to be an overnight process, but with the majority vote secured, the legal work could begin. That alone sent a buzz through the neighborhood. People finally felt in control of their own homes again. But there was still the issue of my stolen property. I drove down to the county records office, making sure my complaint regarding the theft of my motorcycle was properly filed. Since the sale had been done under false pretenses, there was a strong case for recovering it. The tow company that had taken it was listed in the HOA's records, and after a few phone calls, I managed to track down the buyer. A man named Richard Caldwell had purchased it at an HOA auction, completely unaware of the circumstances. When I explained the situation, he was surprisingly cooperative. "I had no idea it was taken illegally," Richard said over the phone. "I just thought it was a legitimate sale. If you can prove it was stolen, I have no problem returning it." It turned out that being HOA president had its perks. I had access to the very documents Nancy had used to authorize the sale, and those same documents proved she had no legal right to do so. With that in hand, I arranged to reclaim my motorcycle. By the afternoon, I was standing in front of Richard's garage as he rolled my bike out. It was in pristine condition, untouched since the day it had been taken. "Glad to see it back where it belongs," Richard said, shaking my hand. I secured the bike onto my trailer and thanked him before heading home. One problem solved, but Nancy wasn't finished. That evening, I found an envelope taped to my front door, no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in sharp, angular handwriting. I tore it open and pulled out the letter inside. It was from Nancy's lawyer, a cease and desist notice. According to the letter, Nancy was claiming defamation, alleging that I had maliciously fabricated accusations against her. She was demanding a public retraction, threatening legal action if I didn't comply. I read the letter twice, then laughed. She really thought this would scare me. I picked up my phone and called my own lawyer, Victoria, a no-nonsense attorney I had worked with before. When I read her the letter, she let out a dry chuckle. "She's bluffing," Victoria said. "She has no case, the evidence against her is solid and she knows it. This is just a desperate attempt to intimidate you into backing down." "Not going to happen," I said. "Good," Victoria replied. "Because if she actually tries to take this to court, she'll only dig herself into a deeper hole. I'll draft a response, but in the meantime, don't engage with her directly. Let her squirm." That was fine by me. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of legal filings and neighborhood meetings. The dissolution of the HOA was officially underway, and the fraud division had begun reviewing the financial records I had submitted. Homeowners were already seeing changes: no more arbitrary fines, no more ridiculous citations. Then came the real blow. Nancy's bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. Word spread fast. People in the neighborhood whispered about how she had been seen arguing with bank staff, demanding access to her funds. Without her stolen HOA money, she was backed into a corner. Then, something even better happened. The county authorities issued a formal fraud investigation against her. I was outside working on my motorcycle when I saw the sheriff's car pull up in front of Nancy's house. 2 uniformed officers stepped out and knocked on her door. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Curtains shifted as people peeked out of their windows. Nancy opened the door, looking disheveled, her usual pristine appearance replaced with a frazzled, panicked look. The officers spoke to her for a moment before handing her a document, a subpoena. Her face went stark white. She tried to argue, but the officers remained firm. After a tense exchange, they turned and walked back to their car, leaving her standing in the doorway, gripping the paper with shaking hands. Tom walked over from his driveway, arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. "Looks like the walls are closing in," he said. She brought it on herself, I replied. Nancy slammed her door shut, but the damage was done. The neighborhood had seen everything, and now there was no escaping the consequences. Nancy's door remained shut long after the sheriff's car had disappeared down the street. The silence that settled over the neighborhood was thick with anticipation. People lingered on their porches, exchanging hushed words and knowing glances, but no one dared approach her house. There was nothing left to say. The law was now involved, and for the first time in years, she wasn't the one holding all the power. I returned to my garage, rolling my motorcycle inside. The weight of everything that had happened in the last few days was starting to settle in. The HOA was dismantling, the fraud investigation was moving forward, and Nancy was finally facing the consequences of her actions. But I knew better than to assume she would go down quietly. The next morning, I was greeted by a new development. As I stepped outside, ready to head to work, I spotted a car parked down the street. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows, positioned just far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to keep an eye on my property. A private investigator, typical Nancy move. She must have hired someone to dig up dirt on me, hoping to find anything she could use as leverage. I walked toward my truck, deliberately turning my head to make eye contact with the driver. The man sitting behind the wheel didn't react, didn't roll down the window, but I caught the slight shift of his posture. He knew I had seen him. Fine, let her waste her money, I wasn't worried. There was nothing to find. By the time I returned home that evening, the car was gone. But I wasn't naive enough to think she had given up. Later that night, I got a call from Victoria. She had just finished drafting the response to Nancy's cease and desist letter and had taken the liberty of filing a counterclaim for defamation and harassment. If Nancy wanted a legal fight, she was going to get one. But Victoria had more news. The fraud division had expedited their review of the HOA's finances due to the overwhelming evidence I had provided. The missing funds weren't just substantial, they were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off over the years, funneled through fake maintenance invoices, inflated service contracts, and outright unauthorized withdrawals. This wasn't just fraud. This was a full-scale financial crime. Victoria explained that the county prosecutor was now involved, and formal charges were being prepared. Nancy wasn't just facing civil penalties anymore, she was looking at criminal prosecution. It was exactly what I had been waiting for. The next day, I called for a final community meeting. The HOA was already in its last days, and people needed to know what was happening. The turnout was even bigger than before. The community center was packed, homeowners eager to hear the latest developments. The energy in the room was different this time, less tense, more hopeful. I stood at the front, holding up a folder filled with documents. "I have good news," I began. "The fraud division has completed their preliminary review, and I can now confirm that criminal charges are being filed against Nancy Delacroix for financial misconduct." A wave of murmurs spread through the room, followed by scattered applause. "She stole our money," a man called from the back. "How much are we talking?" I glanced at the papers in my hands. "The total amount missing is estimated at over $300,000. Gasps filled the room. A woman near the front shook her head in disbelief. "She was stealing from us this whole time," I nodded. "And now she's going to pay for it." Tom, standing near the side, crossed his arms. "So what happens next?" "The HOA is still in the process of being dissolved," I explained. "But now that criminal charges are involved, there will be court proceedings. If convicted, Nancy will not only face prison time, but she'll also be forced to pay restitution." A man in the middle of the crowd let out a low whistle. "So we might actually get some of our money back." Victoria, who had joined the meeting, stepped forward. "It's possible. But the process will take time. Right now, the priority is ensuring that justice is served." The room fell into thoughtful silence. Then a voice spoke up from the back. "What about her house?" Heads turned, and I followed their gaze to see Mr. Caldwell, the man who had unknowingly purchased my stolen motorcycle. He continued, if she stole HOA funds, does she even have the money to fight this? Or is she about to lose everything? Victoria gave a knowing nod. That's a good question. Her assets are currently under review, and if it's determined that she used stolen funds to pay her mortgage or other personal expenses, she could be forced to forfeit her property. The realization settled over the room. Nancy wasn't just losing her power, she was losing everything. The meeting wrapped up with a sense of finality. People were relieved, but there was still a long road ahead. The neighborhood was finally free from her grasp, but the legal battles would take time to resolve. As I stepped outside, I noticed a familiar car parked down the street again. The same black sedan from before. But this time, Nancy wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was standing beside it, arms crossed, waiting for me. I walked toward my house, fully prepared to ignore her, but she spoke before I could get inside. "You think you've won," she said, her voice low and venomous. I turned to face her. "I don't think I know." Her jaw tightened. "I will fight this." I tilted my head slightly. "With what money?" Her nostrils flared, and for the first time I saw something beyond anger in her expression: fear. She had spent years making people's lives miserable, convinced she was untouchable. But now she was standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere left to go. I didn't need to say anything else. I turned and walked inside, leaving her standing there, alone with the reality she had created for herself. Days passed, and then the inevitable happened. The sheriff's department arrived at Nancy's house with an official warrant. Neighbors watched as officers entered her home, emerging with boxes of documents and electronic devices. A foreclosure notice was posted on her door. And by the end of the week, Nancy Delacroix, the woman who once ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, was taken away in handcuffs. Justice had finally arrived. Nancy's house sat in eerie silence for days after her arrest. The lawn, once meticulously maintained through the very HOA she had abused, was already starting to show signs of neglect. The blinds remained drawn, and the once intimidating figure of the neighborhood's most feared woman was nowhere to be seen. It was as if she had been erased overnight. With her gone, an air of relief settled over the neighborhood. People no longer lived in fear of surprise fines or arbitrary enforcement of ridiculous rules. The changes were immediate. Garden decorations reappeared, driveways were used freely, and the tension that had gripped the community for years loosened. But there was still work to be done. Victoria and I spent the next few weeks finalizing the HOA's dissolution, ensuring that every last trace of Nancy's regime was wiped from existence. The financial audit continued, and the numbers were staggering. Not only had she embezzled more than $300,000, but there were also multiple fraudulent contracts signed under the HOA's name, phony maintenance agreements, inflated landscaping costs, and outright fabricated service fees. Each discovery only solidified the case against her. One afternoon, as I was reviewing some of the final paperwork, Tom stopped by, leaning against the frame of my open garage. His expression was lighter than I'd seen in years. He pointed to the documents scattered across my workbench. "That the last of it?" "Just about," I said. "Once this is filed, the HOA is officially history." He nodded, letting out a breath. "Never thought I'd see the day. Feels like the neighborhood can breathe again." I motioned toward the street, where a few neighbors were chatting freely, something that had been rare under Nancy's rule. "People aren't afraid of stepping outside anymore. That tells me we did the right thing." Tom crossed his arms, watching the scene unfold. "What about her house? They really gonna take it?" I stacked the papers and set them aside. "Looks like it. The foreclosure process is moving fast." "The bank isn't wasting time." Tom gave a low chuckle. "Poetic justice." It was. Nancy had spent years using the HOA as her personal kingdom, lording over everyone as if she were untouchable. Now, she wasn't just losing her power, she was losing everything. A few days later, the official foreclosure notice was posted on her door. The house would be auctioned off, and with Nancy still tied up in legal proceedings, it was clear she wouldn't be coming back. Her downfall wasn't just satisfying, it was absolute. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I received a call from Victoria. She had just come from a pretrial hearing where Nancy's attorney had attempted to negotiate a deal. "She's desperate," Victoria said. "She knows the evidence is airtight. They're trying to work out a settlement, but the prosecution isn't budging." I leaned against my truck, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "So what's the next move?" Victoria didn't hesitate. "She's going to trial. And with the sheer amount of fraud involved, she won't be walking away from this." I let the words sink in. It had started with a stolen garage, a blatant abuse of power that Nancy had assumed would go unchallenged. But she had underestimated the one thing she had never truly considered: the people she had been stealing from. The neighborhood had rallied together, exposing her corruption piece by piece. And now, the law was doing the rest. A month later, as I stood outside, watching a new family move into Nancy's former house, I felt something shift. The neighborhood had changed not just in rules, but in spirit. It was no longer a place ruled by fear and manipulation. It was finally a community again. And Nancy. She was exactly where she belonged, behind bars, paying for every single crime she had committed.